The fluorescent lights of the St. Jude's basement hummed a monotonous, lonely tune. It was a sound I'd known for 27 years, a constant companion to the squeak of my cart's wheels and the rhythmic slosh of water in my bucket. My name is Arthur Penhaligon, and for most of my adult life, I've been the man who makes the hospital's forgotten corners shine. The night shift is my kingdom, a quiet, sterile world away from the frantic energy of the floors above. At 3:17 a.m., the hospital holds its breath. It's the hour when the line between recovery and relapse feels thinnest, when the silence is only broken by the distant beep of a machine or a soft cough from a far-off ward. Down here in the labyrinthine corridors of the basement, the silence is heavier. It's a place of function, not healing. Laundry, supplies, maintenance, and at the very end of the West Wing corridor, the morgue. I've never been a superstitious man. You can't afford to be in a place like this. I've cleaned up every fluid the human body can produce, seen grief etched onto the faces of strangers, and learned to treat death as a quiet, administrative finality. The morgue was just another room on my list. A cold room, yes. A somber one, certainly, but it was made of steel, tile, and refrigerated drawers. It held no power over me. Tonight was no different. The air was cool and smelled sharply of bleach, my signature scent. I guided my cart along the polished linoleum floor, its reflection showing a distorted, elongated version of a man in gray overalls, his face weary but his movements precise. I took pride in my work. A clean floor was a sign of order, of control, in a world that was often anything but. The West Wing corridor was always the last leg of my journey. The humming of the lights seemed deeper here, the walls closer together. At the end of it stood the door. It was heavy, stainless steel with no window. A small, black plastic sign was riveted to it. Morgue, authorized personnel only. Beside it, a keypad that I didn't have the code for. Not that I ever wanted it. My job ended at the threshold. I parked my cart about 20 feet away, giving the door a wide berth as I always did out of a sort of procedural respect. I began my work, dipping the mop into the bucket, wringing it out with a satisfying mechanical groan, and starting my pattern of overlapping figure eights on the floor. Slosh, squeak, slide. Slosh, squeak, slide. The rhythm was hypnotic, a meditation in motion. That's when I heard it. It wasn't a loud noise. In the profound silence of the basement, it was surgically precise. A single, sharp click. I froze mid-swipe, my hands tight on the wooden handle of the mop. The sound had come from the end of the hall. It was a mechanical sound, clean and definitive. The sound of a latch, a well-oiled bolt sliding out of its housing. My eyes shot to the stainless steel door. For a second, nothing happened. I told myself it was the ice machine down the hall, or a relay switching over in the electrical room. My mind, ever the pragmatist, was already filing the noise away as an explainable, mundane event. But my body remained tense, my gaze locked on that door. Then, it began to move. It didn't swing open violently. It didn't creak. It moved with a slow, silent, and inexorable grace that was utterly terrifying. The heavy steel door, which should have been locked and immovable from the outside, swung inward. It opened into the pitch-black room beyond, not as if pushed, but as if it were being gently pulled from the other side. The gap widened, 1 inch, then 6, then a foot, until it stood ajar, a perfect black rectangle cut into the sterile white of the corridor. The hum of the fluorescent lights suddenly felt like a scream. The smell of bleach was gone, replaced by a cold, still air that drifted from the doorway, an air that held no scent at all, a complete void. My heart, which had been beating a steady, reliable rhythm my whole life, was now a frantic drum against my ribs. The mop slipped from my suddenly slick hands and clattered to the floor, the noise echoing unnaturally in the corridor. I didn't flinch. I couldn't move. I just stood there, a janitor in a silent basement, staring at an open door that could not possibly be open. It had opened from the inside, and there was no one, nothing, alive in there. For a long moment, which stretched into the elastic time of shock, Arthur remained a statue. His world, once governed by the predictable click of a mop bucket and the hum of fluorescent lights, had fractured. The open morgue door was a gaping wound in his reality, a black void that defied the laws of physics and common sense he'd relied on for nearly 3 decades. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the oppressive silence of the scent. Jude's basement. His first rational thought was a desperate grab for normalcy, a prank. But who? The only other souls in this subterranean level at 3 a.m. were the occasional tired resident on their way to the on-call rooms, and they used the west corridor. No one came down here unless they had to. And more importantly, how? To open that door from the inside, someone would have to be inside. A shiver, entirely unrelated to the basement's chill, traced a cold path down his spine. Slowly, hesitantly, he pushed his cart forward, its squeaking wheels unnaturally loud. He stopped a few feet from the doorway, peering into the darkness. The air that wafted out was sterile, cold, and tinged with the faint, clinical smell of antiseptic. Nothing else. No sound, no movement. Just the silent, stainless steel tables gleaming faintly under the corridor lights that spilled into the room. "Hello," he called out, his voice hoarse and thin. It was a stupid thing to say, he knew instantly. The word was swallowed by the silence, unanswered. He had to be sure. He had to prove his eyes wrong. Gripping the handle of his mop like a weapon, Arthur stepped over the threshold. His rubber-soled shoes made no sound on the polished concrete. The room was exactly as it should be, immaculate, orderly, and empty. The refrigerated lockers were all closed, their indicator lights a uniform, reassuring green. He walked the short length of the room, his breath fogging in the cold air. There was no one here, no place to hide. His attention turned to the door. He examined the lock mechanism from the inside. It was a heavy-duty maglock, supplemented by a solid steel latch bolt. It was designed for security and containment. There was no handle on the inside, only a push bar for emergency egress, but that required significant force and would have triggered an alarm at the security desk. An alarm that hadn't sounded. He ran a hand over the smooth, cold steel. It felt solid, real, uncompromised. Retreating back into the hallway, he felt a wave of dizzying confusion. It wasn't a prank. It wasn't a malfunction he could see. What was left? His mind, a fortress of pragmatism, was under siege. He needed another pair of eyes. He needed someone to tell him he wasn't losing his grip. He walked briskly to the beige, wall-mounted phone at the end of the hall and lifted the receiver. He dialed the 2-digit extension for security. "Security, Dave speaking." The voice was young, laced with the mild boredom of a graveyard shift. "Dave, it's Arthur Penhaligon. Down in the basement corridor. Everything all right, Art? I need you to come down here. It's the morgue door." There was a pause. "The morgue door? What about it?" It opened," Arthur said, the words sounding even more insane when spoken aloud. "All by itself." A weary sigh traveled through the line. "Art, are you sure? Maybe the latch didn't catch." "I watched it catch, Dave. I heard it an hour ago. It's a magnetic lock. It doesn't not catch. Please just come down." 5 minutes later, Dave arrived. He was a man in his late 20s with a perpetually unimpressed look, his uniform slightly too big for his frame. He ambled down the corridor with a heavy-footed gait that spoke of reluctance. "Okay, Art, what's the emergency?" he asked, his eyes scanning the corridor and finding nothing out of place. The morgue door was now closed. Arthur had pushed it shut before calling, not wanting to seem completely unhinged. "I was right there," Arthur said, pointing with a trembling finger. "Cleaning the floor. I heard the lock unlatch and the door it just swung inward, slowly." Dave's expression shifted from boredom to thinly veiled pity. "Inward. Art, that's impossible without the key card or someone opening it from the inside. We'd have gotten an alarm for the push bar." He walked to the door and swiped his own card. The lock beeped and clicked open. He pulled the heavy door toward him. "See? Works fine." He let it swing shut. The latch clicked firmly into place. He tugged on it. It didn't budge. Solid as a rock. "I know how it works, Dave. I'm telling you what I saw." Dave shone his flashlight into the morgue, sweeping the beam across the empty room. "No one's in there. No signs of forced entry. Lock mechanism is functioning perfectly. He turned back to Arthur, his voice softening into a placating tone one might use with a confused grandparent. Look, it's late. These old buildings make noises. Air pressure changes can do weird things. You've probably been on your feet for 6 hours straight. The mind plays tricks. Arthur felt a flush of anger and humiliation. It wasn't a trick of the mind. Okay, Dave said, raising his hands in mock surrender. Tell you what, I'll log it as a mechanical check on Morgue door. How's that? But there's nothing here, Art. It's an empty room and a working lock. He patted Arthur on the shoulder, a gesture that felt more dismissive than comforting, and turned to leave. Try to get some coffee, Art. 2 more hours to go. Arthur watched him walk away, the sound of his footsteps echoing down the hall until they faded, leaving him in silence once more. He was alone again, but everything had changed. He looked at the morgue door, no longer just a part of his familiar workspace, but a monument to the impossible. Dave's skepticism hadn't brought him back to reality. It had shoved him further into isolation. He wasn't crazy. He knew what he saw. And now, a new, cold certainty settled in his gut. He had to prove it. The following night, the familiar scent of antiseptic and floor wax did nothing to soothe Arthur's frayed nerves. Every shadow seemed to stretch a little longer. Every distant hum of a machine sounded like a prelude to something else. His work was a clumsy, automatic sequence of motions. His mind wasn't on the mop bucket or the squeak of his cart's wheels. It was fixed on the morgue, on a heavy steel door that had defied physics. He knew what he had to do. He couldn't rely on the memory that Dave had so easily dismissed. He needed proof, something tangible and irrefutable. The security camera, a small black dome mounted on the ceiling 20 feet down the hall from the morgue, was his only hope. It had a clear line of sight. It must have seen what he saw. Steeling himself, Arthur pushed his cart toward the security office on the ground floor. The walk felt longer than usual, the fluorescent lights overhead buzzing with an accusatory tone. Inside the cramped office, a different guard sat at the bank of monitors. This one was older, with a graying mustache and a weary posture that spoke of decades on the night shift. His name tag read, Sutton. "Can I help you?" Sutton asked without looking up from a crossword puzzle. "Arthur Penhaligon, janitorial," Arthur said, his voice steadier than he expected. "I need to ask a favor. I was hoping to review some footage from last night. Basement corridor near the morgue." Sutton finally looked up, his eyes holding a neutral, bureaucratic flatness. "Incident report? No, not exactly. I thought I saw something. Might have been nothing, but I'd like to be sure." Arthur chose his words carefully, trying not to sound like a lunatic. Sutton sighed, the sound of a man burdened by trivial requests. He swiveled in his chair and tapped a few keys on his keyboard, his movements slow and deliberate. He squinted at the screen. "Basement corridor, C-wing. What time?" "Around 3:15 a.m., Arthur said, the time seared into his memory. More typing. A long silence stretched, punctuated only by the hum of the computers. Arthur's heart hammered against his ribs. This was it, the moment of validation or dismissal. "Sorry," Sutton said, turning back to his crossword. "Can't help you." "What? Why not?" Arthur's voice edged with desperation. "Is the file corrupted?" "No file to corrupt," Sutton grunted, clicking his pen. "Camera C-7 was offline. Log says it was flagged for maintenance 2 days ago. Flickering image, techs haven't gotten down there to fix it yet. It's been recording static since Tuesday." Arthur stared, speechless. The one piece of evidence, the single impartial witness, was conveniently out of order. The perfect, logical, soul-crushing explanation. It was too neat. It felt less like a coincidence, and more like a calculated rebuttal from the universe itself. Defeated, he mumbled a thank you and retreated from the office. The guard's indifference a heavier blow than Dave's condescension. He spent the next hour in a daze, his cleaning a meaningless pantomime. He was alone in this. Absolutely alone. As he emptied a trash can in the small, deserted staff break room, he saw Margaret, a senior nurse from the oncology ward, pouring herself a cup of stale coffee. He'd seen her for years, a permanent fixture of the night shift, her face etched with a quiet competence and a profound weariness. They'd exchanged nods, but never words. An idea born of desperation took root. He cleared his throat. "Long night," he said, his voice startlingly loud in the quiet room. Margaret turned, a flicker of surprise in her tired eyes. She gave him a small, sad smile. "They're all long nights, Arthur." She knew his name. Of course she did. She probably knew everyone's. He leaned against the doorframe, trying to appear casual. "This old building, it makes a lot of noises, doesn't it? The pipes, the drafts." She took a slow sip of her coffee, studying him over the rim of the cup. She wasn't dismissive like Dave or bored like Sutton. She was listening. "It's been standing for a long time. It's got a right to groan a little." Arthur pushed a little further, his heart thumping. "Down in the basement especially. You ever get the feeling that the drafts are a bit much, almost like doors are opening on their own?" He watched her face for any reaction, a scoff, a look of pity. Instead, her expression became guarded. She put her cup down slowly, her gaze drifting toward the window, toward the dark, sleeping city. The silence lingered. "This hospital has its stories," she said finally, her voice low and even. "Things you hear, things people see when they're tired and stressed. It's best not to dwell on them." She picked up her cup and looked at him directly, her eyes conveying a meaning that her words didn't. "Some doors are best left closed, Arthur, for a reason." With that, she gave him a final, decisive nod and walked out of the break room, leaving him alone with the humming refrigerator and the echo of her words. It wasn't a confirmation. It wasn't a shared secret, but it was something. It was the first crack in the wall of his isolation. He wasn't the only one, and Margaret's warning, meant to deter him, had the opposite effect. It told him there was something to find. Margaret's words, "Some doors are best left closed," echoed in Arthur's mind long after his shift ended. They were a lock he now needed a key for. Sleep had become a luxury he could no longer afford. During the day, his small apartment felt like a cage, the silence amplifying the memory of the morgue door swinging open. The sun would stream through his blinds, casting long stripes across the worn hardwood floor, but it brought no warmth, only a harsh reminder of the world outside that continued on, oblivious to the crack that had formed in his own reality. He found himself pacing, running a hand through his thinning hair, the quiet hum of his refrigerator the only sound. The obsession had taken root. He started where anyone in the 21st century would, the internet. Sitting at his small kitchen table with his aging laptop, he typed, "Sent. Jude's hospital strange incidents," into the search bar. The results were a predictable mix of glowing patient reviews, news about charity galas, and announcements for new medical wings. It was all polished, public-facing information, a digital facade as clean and sterile as the hallways he mopped every night. He tried different phrasing. "Sent Jude's deaths," "Sent Jude's accidents," "Sent Jude's old building history." He waded through pages of obituaries and dry architectural records. It was like trying to find a single grain of sand on a vast, empty beach. After 2 hours of fruitless searching, just as he was about to give up and try to get a few hours of sleep before his shift, he stumbled upon it. It wasn't a headline, but a buried comment in a local history forum from 5 years ago. A user named HistoryBuff78 was discussing old Boston construction projects and mentioned a minor tragedy during the St. Jude South wing expansion in the 60s. There were no other details, no replies. It was a digital breadcrumb, but it was more than he'd had before. He sacrificed his sleep. The next afternoon, bleary-eyed and running on lukewarm coffee, Arthur found himself walking into the Boston Public Library. The grand, quiet halls were a world away from the hushed tension of the hospital at night. Here, the silence was one of reverence, not dread. He felt out of place in his simple work pants and faded jacket, a ghost from the night shift haunting the world of the living. A helpful, soft-spoken librarian pointed him toward the microfiche archives. He spent another hour scrolling through reels of the Boston Globe from 1967, the jerky, magnified images of old newsprint making his eyes ache. He was looking for any mention of St. Jude's. He saw articles about the Vietnam War, local politics, advertisements for cars that were now classics. Then he found it. October 12, 1967. The headline was small, tucked away on page B4. Worker's body found at hospital site. His heart hammered against his ribs. He leaned closer to the reader, turning the focus knob with a trembling hand. The article was short, only a few paragraphs. During a rushed expansion of the hospital's basement levels, a section had been sealed off prematurely. A maintenance worker, Elias Vance, 42, had been reported missing by his family weeks earlier. His body was discovered by a construction crew in a sealed-off utility corridor. The very area that, according to the old blueprints Arthur had once seen, now bordered the modern morgue. The official cause of death was listed as dehydration and exposure. It was a forgotten tragedy, a brief column of ink in a sea of yesterday's news. Elias Vance. The name felt heavy, real. This wasn't a story. It was a man's life, ended in darkness and solitude. Arthur printed the article, the machine spitting out a grainy, black-and-white copy. He folded it carefully and placed it in his wallet, the flimsy paper feeling as significant as a court summons. He finally had more than a feeling, more than a fleeting, impossible memory. He had a name. That night, the hospital felt different. The long, sterile corridors of the basement no longer felt empty, but filled with a profound sense of history and sorrow. The low hum of the ventilation system sounded like a sigh. When he pushed his cart past the morgue, he didn't feel the same sharp spike of fear. Instead, he felt a strange sense of connection, of understanding. He wasn't chasing a ghost, he was uncovering a forgotten life. His obsession had found its purpose. Later in his shift, he saw Margaret at the nurse's station, diligently writing notes in a patient's chart under the soft glow of her desk lamp. He took a deep breath, the folded newspaper article in his wallet, a solid weight against his hip. He knew what he had to ask her now. It wasn't about flickering lights or strange noises anymore. It was about Elias Vance. The weight of the photocopied newspaper article in my jacket pocket felt heavier than a set of keys. It was a tangible piece of a forgotten tragedy, a name and a face that transformed the morgue door from a random anomaly into an echo of a life cut short. When I clocked in that evening, the usual sense of routine was gone. The familiar scent of antiseptic cleaner and floor wax didn't bring its usual comfort. Tonight, I wasn't just cleaning the floors of St. Jude's. I was walking through the final moments of Elias Vance's life. My cart rattled down the basement corridor, the sound unnervingly loud in the profound silence. Each scuff of my shoes on the linoleum seemed to mark a step closer to a truth I was no longer sure I wanted to find. Fear had been replaced by a somber determination, a feeling of responsibility to the man in the grainy photograph. I deliberately saved the basement level for last, needing to build my nerve. I needed to find Margaret. I saw her around 2 a.m., standing at the nurse's station on the 3rd floor, methodically filling out a chart. Her face, etched with the lines of 1,000 night shifts, was illuminated by the cool glow of the desk lamp. The hallway was quiet, the only sounds the soft beep of a distant monitor and the whisper of the ventilation system. It was now or never. I parked my cart and walked over, my heart thumping a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. She looked up as I approached, her eyes showing mild surprise before settling into their usual weary watchfulness. "Arthur," she acknowledged with a slight nod. "Everything quiet downstairs?" I leaned against the counter, keeping my voice low. "About as quiet as it gets." I paused, gathering my thoughts. "Margaret, you told me some doors are best left closed. I think I know which one you were talking about." Her pen stopped moving. She didn't look at me, but I saw her knuckles tighten around it. I took that as my cue to continue. "I found something at the library," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "A newspaper article from 1967, about a man named Elias Vance." The name hung in the air between us. Margaret slowly put her pen down. She finally turned her head and looked directly at me, her expression unreadable but intense. It wasn't the shock of someone hearing a ghost story. It was the shock of a well-kept secret being unearthed by an outsider. She glanced down the empty hall before motioning with her head toward the small, empty staff break room nearby. "In here." Inside, the room smelled of stale coffee and microwave popcorn. She closed the door almost all the way, leaving just a crack. She leaned against the small kitchenette counter, crossing her arms. "Where did you hear that name?" "I told you, the library archives, an accident during construction." She let out a long, slow breath, a sound of resignation. "The papers never got the whole story." "They never do." She looked at me, really looked at me, as if deciding how much I was worthy of hearing. Elias wasn't just some name on a crew roster. He worked here for 15 years, knew these pipes and wires better than the architects did. He had a wife, 2 kids, lived over on Munjay Hill. Suddenly, Elias Vance was no longer a black and white photo. He was a man with a family, a home. "The story the old-timers passed down," Margaret continued, her voice soft and laced with melancholy, "is that he was worried about a faulty steam pipe in that new section they were walling up. He kept telling the foreman it wasn't safe, but they were behind schedule. Rushing. On the day of the accident, he supposedly went in for one last check before they sealed the final panel. No one knows if they didn't see him or if they just didn't listen." The cold reality of it settled in my stomach. It wasn't just an accident, it was negligence. A man was ignored and it cost him his life. "They didn't find him for 2 days, she said, her gaze distant. "The morgue is right next to where that corridor was. Some people, some of the staff who have been here as long as I have, they think he's still making his rounds, still checking on things, trying to make sure everything is right." Her words connected everything. A meticulous man, worried about safety, trapped in the walls. A door that shouldn't open, swinging wide as if being checked one last time. It wasn't a haunting, it was a habit, an echo of duty carved into the very fabric of the place. I finally found my voice. "Is there anyone still around who knew him, who worked with him?" Margaret thought for a moment, her brow furrowed. "Most are gone now, but there's Frank Gable. He was just a kid then, an apprentice in the maintenance department. Elias was his mentor. Frank retired about 10 years ago, but I think he still lives in South Portland. He'd be close to 80 now." She gave me a name, a new lead, a direct link to the past. "Thank you, Margaret," I said, the words feeling inadequate. "Thank you," she just nodded. "Be careful, Arthur. Raking up the past, it can stir up more than just dust." I left her there and returned to my cart, my mind reeling. The mystery was no longer about a strange event, but about a man's story that had been buried in brick and silence. As I finally pushed my mop across the basement floor, passing the morgue, I felt a profound shift inside me. The hallway no longer felt empty or menacing. It felt sad. It felt like a memorial, and I knew my job wasn't finished. The name, Frank Gable, felt heavy in Arthur's pocket, jotted on a slip of paper from Margaret's notepad. He left the hospital as the first hint of dawn washed over Portland. The cool, damp air of a Maine morning, a welcome shock after the sterile, recycled atmosphere of the basement. The exhaustion from his shift was a familiar ache in his bones, but today it was overshadowed by a restless energy. He wasn't just a janitor anymore. He was a custodian of a story that had been buried for 50 years. He bypassed his small apartment and drove his old Ford sedan to a 24-hour diner he knew. A place where fishermen and third shifters like himself could get a hot coffee without any fuss. Sitting in a worn vinyl booth, he sipped the bitter brew and laid out his plan. Frank Gable would be an old man now, likely in his late 70s or early 80s. Finding him wouldn't be as simple as a Google search, especially for a man of that generation. Arthur started with the thick, worn-down phone book tethered to the diner's payphone. There were 3 F. Gables and 1 Franklin. He jotted them down. His first 2 calls from the rattling payphone were dead ends. An impatient woman told him her father-in-law Frank passed a decade ago, and he'd been a postman. The second number was disconnected. He felt a pang of frustration. This was a fragile thread, easily broken by time. He needed a more methodical approach. He went to the public library when it opened, the quiet sanctuary a stark contrast to his clanging cart at the hospital. Using one of their public computers, he accessed online public records and white pages. He knew Frank was Elia's apprentice and had worked at the hospital, so he likely lived in or around South Portland. He cross-referenced the names from the phone book with age estimates and property records. One entry stood out: Franklin Gable, age 82. The address was a small street in a quiet, older neighborhood of South Portland, filled with the kind of modest, post-war homes built for working families. Driving over the Casco Bay Bridge, Arthur felt a knot of anxiety tighten in his stomach. The sun was higher now, glinting off the water. What was he going to say? "Hello, I'm the janitor at your old workplace." A door opened by itself, and I think it's the ghost of your dead mentor. They'd call the police. He had to be delicate. He'd stick to the truth, or at least a version of it. He was looking into the hospital's history, the people's history. The house was exactly as he'd pictured it: a small, tidy Cape Cod with blue siding and a perfectly manicured lawn. A lifetime of pride and hard work was evident in the weed-free flower beds and the neatly painted trim. This was someone's sanctuary. He was about to disturb it. He parked, walked up the concrete path, and took a deep, steadying breath before knocking on the solid wood door. After a moment, it opened. A small woman with sharp, intelligent eyes and perfectly coiffed white hair stood there, her expression a mixture of curiosity and caution. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice polite but firm. "Good morning, ma'am. I'm looking for Mr. Frank Gable," Arthur said, trying to keep his tone even and respectful. She looked him over, his simple work pants, his clean but worn jacket. "Who's asking?" "My name is Arthur Penhaligon. I work at St. Jude's." Her posture softened slightly at the mention of the hospital. "Frank," she called over her shoulder, "someone from the hospital is here to see you." Footsteps shuffled from within, and then a man appeared behind her. Frank Gable was tall but stooped with age, leaning heavily on a wooden cane. His face was a roadmap of wrinkles, but his eyes, though clouded with age, were sharp and skeptical. He looked at Arthur with an undisguised weariness. "St. Jude's," he said, his voice a low gravel. "I haven't set foot in that place in 20 years. What's this about?" "Mr. Gable," Arthur began, feeling the man's impatience. "I know this is unexpected. I'm a janitor there, on the night shift." He offered his own blue-collar credentials as a bridge. "I've been taking an interest in the hospital's history, not the doctors or donors, but the men who built it, the men who kept it running." Frank grunted, unimpressed. "They've got archives for that. Now, if you'll excuse us." He began to move back, his wife ready to shut the door. Panic seized Arthur. He couldn't lose him. "I'm interested in a man you worked with," he said, his voice coming out a little louder than intended. "A man named Elias Vance." The name hung in the air like a sudden frost. Frank Gable froze, his hand tightening on his cane. The skepticism in his eyes was instantly replaced by a storm of emotions Arthur couldn't quite read: pain, shock, and a profound 50-year-old sorrow. His wife placed a gentle hand on his arm, her own face etched with concern. Frank's gaze locked onto Arthur's, truly seeing him for the first time, not as an intrusion, but as a messenger from a place he'd long since left behind. "Elias," Frank whispered, the name a fragile thing on his lips. He stared at Arthur, his mind clearly reeling back through the decades. "Why, after all this time, are you asking about Elias Vance?" Frank Gable's shoulders, once rigid with suspicion, slumped in defeat. He stared at Arthur, his watery blue eyes seeing not a stranger, but a messenger from a past he had spent 50 years trying to bury. The cold Maine air swirled around them, carrying the scent of salt and pine. Finally, he gave a slow, tired nod. "You better come inside," he rasped, his voice rough with disuse. "It's been a long time since I've said that name out loud." Inside, Frank's home was meticulously clean, a small, quiet world filled with faded photographs and the scent of old wood. He motioned for Arthur to sit in a worn armchair while he shuffled to the kitchen to pour 2 glasses of water. When he returned, he didn't sit, but stood by the mantelpiece, his hand resting on a framed picture of a much younger man with a confident smile, Elias Vance. "He wasn't just my boss," Frank began, his gaze fixed on the photo. He was the closest thing I had to a father, taught me everything. How to sweat a pipe, how to true a frame, how to take pride in a job well done. And he was meticulous, borderline obsessed, especially about safety." Frank took a shaky breath. There was a steam main in that old service corridor, a high-pressure line. Elias said the welds from the original construction were shoddy. He'd check the pressure gauges every single day, and they were always fluctuating. He wrote memos, filed reports. He warned our foreman, a man named Henderson, that the pipe was a catastrophic failure waiting to happen. He said if it ever burst, it would be like a bomb going off in that tunnel. Henderson, Frank explained, was a man cutting corners to make his budget look good. He dismissed Elias' concerns as fear-mongering. "He called Elias an old woman," Frank said, his voice laced with ancient bitterness. "Told him to just do his job and let the engineers worry about it. The plan was already in motion to decommission and seal that whole wing of the basement. Henderson just wanted it done." The day they put the wall up, Frank was there. Elias was agitated all morning. He told me, "One last look, Frank. I'm going to take some photos of the welds, get my own proof." He grabbed his tool bag and a camera and went down the hall. A few minutes later, Henderson sent me to the other side of the hospital to fetch some supplies. A pointless errand just to get me out of the way. Frank's voice cracked. "When I got back, the concrete blocks were already halfway up. I didn't see Elias. I asked Henderson, and he just waved me off, said Elias must have clocked out. I believed him. I was young, you believe your foreman." The next day, Elias was a no-show. Henderson claimed he'd quit. The lie held. No one knew Elias was entombed behind 20 feet of corridor and a fresh block wall, a silent victim of institutional negligence. Frank's guilt had been his own private prison ever since. Arthur listened, the pieces clicking into place. The phantom sound, the impossible door, it wasn't a ghost, it was physics. "Frank," Arthur said gently, leaning forward, "that pipe, it finally gave way." Frank looked at him, confused. "What are you talking about?" "The hospital just finished a major HVAC overhaul last month," Arthur explained. "They probably had to reroute pressure through some of the old mains. Your mentor was right. The pipe couldn't take it. It must have ruptured. A sudden blast of high-pressure steam in a sealed corridor, it had nowhere to go. It would have acted like a battering ram. The morgue door was the weakest point in the structure. The pressure forced it open from the inside." Frank stared, his mouth agape, as 50 years of haunting superstition evaporated, replaced by the stark, mechanical truth. The ghost wasn't a spirit seeking vengeance. It was an echo of a problem that had never been solved. It was Elias' final, vindicated warning. Relief and resolve washed over Frank's face. "He deserves to be found," he whispered. "They have to know." With Frank's blessing, Arthur didn't call security. He called the hospital's CEO at home. He explained everything, his voice calm and steady, detailing the 50-year-old tragedy and the immediate danger the compromised pipe posed to the hospital's foundation. He had a witness. He had a name. He could no longer be dismissed. 2 days later, the basement was filled not with silence, but with the sound of jackhammers. Arthur stood beside Frank and Margaret, watching as the crew breached the wall. When the dust settled, they found him. Elias Vance's remains lay near a rusted tool bag, a silent testament to his final duty. A few feet away, the massive steam pipe was warped and split, a faint hiss of steam still escaping from a jagged tear. Elias was given a proper burial. The hospital publicly acknowledged the failure and honored him as a man who had tried to prevent it. For Frank, it was the end of a lifetime of guilt. For Margaret, it was the closing of a dark chapter in the hospital's history. For Arthur, it was back to work. The hum of his floor buffer was the same, the halls just as quiet. But as he passed the morgue, its heavy door now securely shut, he felt a profound sense of peace. He had listened to the silence, and in doing so, had given a forgotten man a voice, proving that some duties go far beyond keeping the floors clean.